announcements, and then we'll have a prayer, which Jeremy has graciously agreed to lead for me this morning. First one, obviously, is related to the camp that's coming up in June. Adam and Ashley Clark are in charge of that. I think they're still out of town. But if there is still room and you're interested, they're the ones you need to check with. If you have any questions, just let them know. And we'll see if we can get you all out there. We're planning to go, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And then next, John, anything you want to say about this?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we went to LTC last weekend in Richmond, Washington, and this evening we'll get a chance to show you all some of what we worked on. If you guys could be here at the building at 4 o'clock, we're going to do some of the team events before services from 4 to 5, and then the young men are going to help out with the service from 5 to 6. And then we'll have the puppet skit afterwards, followed by a potluck, and we'll give the kids their awards. So it'd be great if you guys could come and support their efforts in LTC, and also bring some finger foods to share, and it'd be great. And after services, I'll probably need help clearing this out and putting in more tables if you're available this morning after services to mess up the fellowship hall.
Awesome. Yeah. I had it all written down, ready to go if you weren't ready yourself. So cool. Is there anything else that we want to announce before we take prayer requests? I see no hands. Okay. What would we like to pray about this morning? Any concerns, any praises that you'd like to share?
I'm meeting with someone tomorrow. He's a real estate broker, and just hoping that goes well. See if I can help him with his mortgage business. But
Nice. Very cool.
looking forward to it. I just met 2 of his realtors yesterday by default. It was really random.
Wow. Okay.
As far as that goes well.
So April's meeting with a realtor tomorrow, you said?
Yeah, like a real estate broker.
Broker. And she's just hoping that meeting goes well. So asking for that.
Prayer and praise that LTC went well, so just keep going with that.
Yeah.
And it'll go well this evening.
Yeah, the kids and everybody who helped put in a lot of work. It went really, really well. It was really encouraging. Any other prayer requests this morning? All right. Thank you, sir.
Let's pray. Dear Lord, we're so thankful for another day that you blessed us with. We know that we're not guaranteed a new day, but you provide that for us. Thankful that we could come here like this and open up your word, learn from it, and see how it can change our lives for the better. Father, we thank you so much for Eric and his willingness to teach this class. I pray that you would be with him and help him to provide the lesson that he's prepared in a powerful way, Father, just to do it today. I want to pray, Father, for April and the meeting she has coming up. I pray that everything would go well for that, and that we continue to bless April. She's such a blessing to our congregation, and you provide good things for her, Father. So worth it. Thank you for her. Father, I pray to thank you for the safe travels that you provided for the LTC crew. We're glad everybody's back safe. They had a good time, and they were able to go up there to eat. Pray that you would be with them today as the kids sent to us and show us what they were able to do. And just bless them, Father, and pray that this experience that they've been able to have will be something that they cherish in memories for a long time. And thank you for John and Rebecca who keep that up.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your son Jesus who died for us, and it's in his name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's start off with a recap of where we are in this study, where we were before. So a few weeks ago at the beginning of the month, Clint kind of introduced this next series for the quarter. We're going through this book, Paul's Sermon on Mars Hill by Brother Mac Lyon. And it's the latter part of Acts 17 where Paul is addressing people in Athens. And he's teaching them about this one true God that they know nothing about, the unknown God idol that they have. And to be frank, God is largely unknown by a lot of people today as well. And us in the church can also know him better than we do. So this is going to be a really good class. At the beginning of the month, Clint introduced kind of what we were going to get into with this. And then we took a break the next week for the men's rally. And then last week, Clint taught the class, and I was at LTC with a bunch of other people and missed it. So we're going to go through it. He was gracious enough to give me a rundown of kind of what was covered, and so it's a bit of a preview for those of us who need to still go watch it on YouTube. Unknown God, the Creator, Chapter 2, or Lesson 2 from the book is what Clint went over, and basically they covered the blunt statement that Paul made right there at the beginning of verse 24. God is Creator and Lord both. And also went through just how much evidence there is available to us today to verify that. They didn't really get into Christian evidences too much, but it's there, it's available to us, and there's plenty of it if we just take the time and effort to dig into it. Next point he made was that because of that, we can know God, right? That's something that we are able to do, and he wants us to know him. I think that's pretty powerful, and because of that, he's given us all these different ways that we can learn more about him and kind of understand who he is and what he's all about. So in order for us to do that, we need to spend time in his word, reading and listening to what he's telling us. We need to be around his people who are trying to do the same thing. And then what we're learning, we need to actually follow and obey, right? That makes sense. When we do these things, that's how we make it known to other people that we actually do know God, right? They can see him in us because we're hopefully becoming more and more like him the more we learn about him. So this morning, we're going to be covering the next chapter, Lesson 3. God, the sovereign ruler of the world. We're going to try to cover everything that's in this chapter. It's kind of a big topic, so getting through all of it in one class, we'll see. But we're going to focus initially on this next section of verse 24, where he makes the assertion that God is Lord of heaven and earth, and kind of dig into that a little bit. What does that mean? And then we're going to get into sovereignty. What does it actually mean for God to be sovereign? What is sovereign? We'll talk about that a little bit. And then once we've kind of got a high-level understanding of that, how are we supposed to respond to that? Is what we'll spend the rest of the class talking about. So we're going to jump right in because, again, I'm not sure if we have too much stuff or not enough stuff. It's one of those gray areas. Sometimes you know, sometimes you don't. So before we do that, though, let's get a little bit of a context refresher. Can somebody read Acts 17:22 through 24, please?
Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God. 24, right?
Yeah, through 24.
Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, why does Paul say that God is Lord? We're going to start off kind of looking at that a little bit. At the beginning of verse 24, he indicated, that he's talking about the God, this unknown God, and he's telling them who this is, or he's about to. But then right after that, he indicates that this God is Lord of. And I thought it was interesting. He didn't say this is a Lord. He said this is the Lord. And it's kind of reinforcing that first point about the God. There is only one. And this one is Creator and Lord both. So we're going to kind of dig into both of those. It made me think of Ephesians 4, those first 6 verses where it talks about one God, one Lord, one bunch of things. So I encourage you to kind of look at that. It's nice to see Paul being consistent throughout different letters and what he's talking about. So the author, Brother Lyon, he mentioned how many times God is referred to as Lord or Lord God in the Old Testament. Anybody have any guesses on how many times? It's a big number. Not quite that big.
In the hundreds.
Yeah, it is in the hundreds, yeah.
That really narrows it down. But
Over 500, 533 times. Yeah. Now, I didn't dig in to see if it's the exact same Lord word used every single time, but just FYI. In the New Testament, 13 times. So not as many times, but there's a lot of other names that are given to God as well. And in Revelation, it talks about Lord God Almighty, a little bit different, and multiple times as well. In Revelation 19:6 in particular, there's one of the references, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But what is it's talking about there in that verse, ascribing to God this majesty. Paul is kind of reaffirming that, or he's echoing that same message here in this verse, that God is this sovereign God over everything. And that's so much more than the Athenians' concept of gods. It's very, very different to them. So with that, as God is sovereign, he is Lord, ruler over everything, you got to remember that part of the crowd that he's talking to in Athens are Stoics and Epicureans, right? Which Clint mentioned a few weeks ago. Does anybody remember what the Stoics were about and what the Epicureans were about? What was kind of their high level? Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, that was part of it. Yeah. Okay. So just what was mentioned by the author again in this chapter, Stoics in general believed that the world was just governed by the fates. So again, multiple parties. And Epicureans, a little bit different. They believed that gods were not interested in the everyday affairs of the world. So multiple parties and different levels of involvement with the world itself. So coming from that background, hearing what Paul's talking about, very, very different than what they're used to, right? Kind of interesting to think about. So let's see here. And again, Paul is kind of indicating that God is over everything. He's not multiple different parties. He's not just in charge of everything, though. And I think that's something that's important to bring out. We're kind of going to look at that, right? He's not a boss or a parent or something like that, where there's some authority, but there's some limitations to it. With God being the sovereign ruler over everything, there's a distinction what actual sovereignty means. And we're going to look at that today. So before we move to the next slide, does anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments before we keep going? Jake?
So just something that I've been curious about. Paul here is not going into a long dissertation with Jews inside of a synagogue.
Mm.
And the temple's still standing, the second temple, and the presence of God or the glory of God is in the temple. He still makes the statement that the worshiping God doesn't stop the temple to take hands.
Mm.
And perhaps it would have been more striking to them. I just find that to be, for us, of course, it's obvious.
Yeah.
That's true today, but probably a little bit less obvious. But more contrasting.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting comment. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, when we look up Lord, it has to do with someone having power, authority, or influence, master or ruler is what it says. And every other kind of Lord, right, is Lord of like already created somethings, right? Beings, humans,
Yeah.
or the sea or whatever, right? It's just God created everything that could have a Lord over it. So he's both sides. And also the highest level of authority we're used to asking when we look at companies or we talk to someone, well, who's the highest level of authority around here?
Yeah.
And, so we're always looking for, what to compare everything to,
Yeah.
who to answer to.
No, that's a good comment. That's right where we're going. Yeah, yeah. What is lordship? What is sovereignty? So, what does it actually mean for God to be Lord, like Paul said, or sovereign ruler, kind of the same concept? What comes to your mind when you think about a sovereign or a lord? It's not a word we use. Yeah, that was my first thought as well. Yeah, and I've got a few on here, but let's see what y'all come up with. Without looking up in the dictionary.
Never looking up over his shoulder.
Okay. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought of it. Yeah, Alex.
Power is not shared.
Okay. Yeah, chair power. You're not worried about anybody behind you over your shoulder. Good comment. Yeah, Linda.
Dominion over?
Dominion. That's a good word. Yeah.
King of Kings, so don't get higher than that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the same things that I was thinking about, but some other ones too. Oh, one more, Dan.
His authority is incontrovertible. It's not shared with anybody, but also everybody under him doesn't dispute it at all. They understand, you're sovereign. Everybody knows it.
Yep. That's really good. Same kind of things I was thinking about, and when I also looked it up, same kind of things that are there. So we're on the right track. This is good. Not a boss, not an elected official, not a parent. A sovereign is somebody who is completely in charge. It's just at a higher level. Here in the States, I'm a dual citizen, so I can say this. We have our democracy, or whatever you want to call it. We elect everybody. There's supposed to be accountability, and the people are the ones who are in charge, right? I grew up in Canada. It's a separate nation. It's still part of the British Commonwealth. They have a figurehead who's the Queen's representative. Other parts of the world are maybe a little bit more familiar with having somebody who's in complete control, and you really have no say over the decisions that they make, or who's in charge. In this case, God is over everything as a sovereign. He has complete control, absolute power. He's acknowledged. He's autonomous. All of these things that we talked about, as sovereign, these would be things that God would have, would be part of him. So we're going to dig into this a little bit more. And in the lesson, the author actually defines sovereignty by referencing another book and is spending most of the chapter kind of going through the points that other author made in that other book. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to kind of follow suit. And this is that other book, or at least a later publication of it. The Knowledge of the Holy by A.J. Tozer. It was first published in 1963. I did not know anything about Mr. Tozer at all, so I did a little bit of Wikipedia digging on him. Apparently he was a pastor for a Protestant evangelical denomination for 40 plus years, primarily in the Chicago area, but he moved around a little bit. He passed away in 1963. So I guess this was published the year he died. I didn't realize that, or right around that same time. He's a very prolific author, though. He wrote dozens and dozens of books. Most of them were published posthumously, but this was one of the ones that was published. I think it might have been 61 when it was published. It was really, really close to when he passed. So in that book, he argues that for God to be sovereign, he would need to possess three traits. This is how he's defining sovereignty. So God would first need to be all-knowing. We're going to get into that a little bit. Next, he would need to be all-powerful, and those were kind of two of the first ones that came to my mind, and we've kind of covered those a little bit. And then this last one didn't really come to my mind until I read it. I was like, I hadn't really thought about that. But God would also need to be absolutely free. And the way that he kind of coined that, I wasn't sure what he meant until I kept reading. So we're going to look at those. And we're going to discuss what Mr. Tozer is talking about, how God possesses these traits, and then because he does, he's a sovereign, he's Lord and ruler over heaven and earth, just like Paul said in verse 24. So let's move along and look at the first one. God must be all-knowing. What does all-knowing mean? It seems kind of obvious looking at the word, but let's dig into it a little bit. What do you think of when you hear all-knowing? What's the fancy word for that? What's that? Starts with an O. There we go, omniscient. We'll get to that one, yes. That's one, or knowing everything, all-knowing, same kind of thing, right?
She's not all-knowing.
It's knowing everything that has happened and having a complete knowledge of all, but knowing everything that's going to happen.
Okay. So there's no
Knowledge of
limitation by time.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no limitation at all. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, infinite awareness and insight, all of these kind of eternal, all-encompassing words, understanding knowledge with no limits, nothing is incomplete, right? It's just everything, backwards, forwards, now, up, down, whatever direction you want to go, all of it is covered. That was really interesting. So I'm going to read some quotes from the book just because I think they say it better than I can, and then we'll go through that, and then we'll talk about those a little bit before we continue. So the first is the point being made that if there is one smidgen, great word, of knowledge that is unknown to God, then his rule over all things breaks down at that point. Even that little bit would open the door to man to say that because one God does not know everything, there must be two or more gods at work, right? So, I think that's probably a fair point. If God is all-knowing, then that means he has nothing to learn. This is kind of just talking about Clint. As created beings, we're constantly learning about new things, right? And if we're honest, we're constantly being reminded of the things that we don't know. But God, if he's all-knowing, he's never known any less. He's never going to know any more. He's always known everything. His knowledge is eternal and overall. I thought that was an interesting thing to think about. I hadn't really looked at that too much. It's an awesome thought to think about God being all-knowing. But if God knows everything about everything, then he knows everything about me and everything about my life, right? And to some people, that thought is really frightening. And to other people, it's a source of joy. So why do you think there's different reactions to that? When you actually take time to think about it, why would you react one way or the other?
Well, it's just goes back to God is their life, Lord in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Having to give up your people, your life, to something higher than you. To maybe a drug addict or something in their life, they find that free. But to someone, their life is perfect, have it all figured out, it's terrifying to think, at the end, I'm still going to have to give an account.
I think it can depend on our understanding of sin and forgiveness as well.
Yeah. Point, Alex.
I think it kind of fits all of James' perspective, where if there is a God that is all-knowing, then it's comfort. That's my teaching.
Mm-hmm. It can be. Yeah, should be.
Well, there's that scripture about everything's laid bare before him.
Mm-hmm.
And, when somebody wants to do the facade thing and try to hide their life from everyone because they're not making the right choices on purpose,
Yeah.
the one that knows everything, it's like, oh man,
Yeah. Even the stuff in the
can't
darkness.
do that with you.
Yeah.
That's probably my thought.
Yeah. Okay, Blake.
This can be challenging for some people too, because since we can physically see God, I know, sometimes a lot of people think they can do whatever they want, and then maybe later in life start making the decisions that fix their life. It's like God's been watching us, the whole time,
Yeah.
because no one's going to act the same way if they know that, if God was standing there physically, staring
Yeah.
at them, whatever, they would not do the same things that they do. But since we can't, see that physical presence of God, it's hard for a lot of people to really, make those right decisions all the time, or choose to.
That he's there and he's it. Yeah. Yeah.
This makes me think of the story of Jonah.
Mm.
Can't hide.
Yep. Yeah. Can't hide, can't run.
Why knowledge of God can be kind of fearful. I think there's so much to that. I think I think it's kind of mentioned, like it's kind of in a way almost being displayed naked from God,
Oh.
because everything is laid bare.
Yeah. Nothing's
Kind of
hidden.
a scary thing.
Yeah.
Because he could see through you and everything you've done, good or bad, and I think that could be a scary thing. It also, I think we interact with each other on that limited knowledge thing. We ask each other questions to try to find things out. But when it would come to God, it changes a lot, because what are you going to ask, or what would you request, or how would you communicate with God that already knows everything? I think it's very different.
Yeah. You guys are smart and you have good thoughts.
Oh, that thought. Remember, everybody does that. Well, if Jesus was here, would you watch that movie? They're like, don't remind me.
What would Jesus do? Yeah. Everybody's got their bracelet somewhere. Fun. So I thought of a few verses. Anybody off the top of their head recognize what some of those are talking about? There's obviously not a comprehensive list here, but
Yeah, there's that song
Uh-huh.
That word, he would go everywhere.
Okay.
Um,
Yep. Yep. You can't go anywhere. Okay. So Job is the whole where were you when I, right? Like he knows everything because he was there. He did it all. And then Psalm 139 about nothing being hidden, no matter where you are, what you're talking about. Isaiah 40, it's the who has counseled the Lord, right? Like he doesn't need counsel because he knows everything, right? Nobody's going to tell him something he doesn't know. Matthew 6, he knows what we need. You don't have to worry. Matthew 10, nothing's hidden. He knows the hairs on our head. He sees the sparrow fall. He sees all the stuff that's in the dark. Nothing's hidden. There's just so many, right? We're going to keep moving along just because we're getting a little tight on time here. All right, so next. All-powerful. So God would have to be not just all-knowing, but also all-powerful. And this is the emphasis that Paul's making when he uses that word Lord in Athens. So like we were talking about with all knowledge, all power. What is all-powerful to you? What does that mean?
Action.
Okay.
Can actually achieve, like if you
Can
think
do
about
anything? Yeah.
planning something and someone says there's a war coming and how do we do it, strategize, the president, well, what about the military? What are you guys thinking? Like they have to take,
Okay.
the action, and so like he's all powerful, so he handles everything. He's not just all knowing, right?
Yeah. He's not just the idea, but he's also the carrying out of it.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Did I see another hand? All right. Same kind of things. You've got the authority, the influence, the power. It's at a supreme level. There's just strength, ability to do anything, control over everything. And then that word almighty that we talked about, that's in Revelation a bunch. There's just no limitation on what he is able to do. So let's look again at some quotes from the book here. If it could be shown that there is just one stray atom of power that the Lord God does not control, he would be seen as a limited ruler and not sovereign at all. And like we talked about with his knowledge, God's power has also never changed. It's also something that has been constant and eternal and is over everything. God's power is what Jesus referenced in Matthew 19, starting in verse 23, where he's talking about all things are possible with God. It's in the context of the rich man entering into heaven, but he makes that comment with God, all things are possible. Genesis 18, God affirms when he's talking to Abram and Sarah about the promise of Isaac. Is anything too hard for him? He was able to provide them with a child even though they shouldn't have been able to have a child. And then John's vision of heaven from Patmos, Revelation 19, where God is being worshipped as powerful and as Lord and as the almighty ruler. Just this over everything, able to do anything that he wants to. It's an interesting concept, but I think it's one we kind of are, God can do that, right? We know that. It's not something that's really too difficult for us to grasp, perhaps. So again, some more verses to think about. Anybody know what happens in the first two books of Genesis? Thank you. What about Exodus 7 through 12? All the LTCers should know this. The plagues
Everyone look at John.
no. These are the plagues of Egypt. A couple chapters later in Exodus 14, crossing of the Red Sea. 2 Kings 6, this is the army of fire and the Syrians being blinded, and that was really interesting. Daniel 3, the fiery furnace. And then I kind of cheated and just said miracles of Jesus because that's a ton of stuff. Matthew 27 and 28, death and resurrection of Jesus. That's kind of a big one. Just all of these displays of absolute power, of being able to do things that shouldn't, from what we're used to, be able to be done. Yes.
Just a quick one. When I was been in Luke, and when the apostles, when they were on the boat, and then when Christ stopped the waves and the wind,
Yeah.
it was enough of acknowledgement that they said, "Who is this that can?" Because they'd already seen Jesus'
Yeah.
miracles, right?
Yeah.
But he could even do
Yeah, it kind of hit you a little bit
Yeah.
different that time.
I wish the wind could stop like recently a lot, but
Well, the tornado situation, we really,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, it could be worse. Yes, sir.
What's also interesting about a lot of the miracles that you pointed out up there and others is he would use different methods. He
Mm.
spoke the world into creation. Some of the plagues of Egypt and across the Red Sea done. So sometimes things were done through the apostles. Sometimes Jesus spat on the ground and run mud in somebody's eyes. So what's cool is he's not even limited by his methods.
Yeah, he can do what he wants, how he wants. Yeah, that's a good point. Jake?
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, maybe add to the list, ease of accomplishment.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
with my limited power, I can think of things that I'm capable of doing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, I'm like, I just don't know if it's worth the effort. I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
There is no effort with
Cost
God.
benefit.
Not only is he capable of doing everything, it's easy for him to do everything.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Did you have your hand up? No? Clint?
I think the idea of all powerful, you think of God and then specifically thinking of Jesus. To be all powerful, the only limitations you can have are the ones you put on yourself.
Mm.
And like God even said, we know God can't deceive, God can't sin. That's a limit he put on himself. Jesus, when he's on the earth, says, all I can do is what I do through the Father. I'm here to do what I'm asked to do in this form or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's part of being all powerful. The only limits I have are the limits I set. You don't set my limits, I do.
Yeah.
But I will set limits.
Yeah.
Which is bizarre.
Okay. Yes, did you have?
I was going to say similar to what they said, but most of these examples, you also see gentleness and love with his power,
Mm-hmm.
which I think plays into that all powerful. And the all knowing. He knows what his power can do, and he knows how to use it well.
Yeah, the best way to do it. Yeah, it's a great comment.
Well, you think of the straight and narrow that we're supposed to stay on at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Supposed to, right? We, trail off and then run into problems and then like, where's that straight and narrow? I need to get back on it. And God's like, I'm not going to trail off. I'm going to stay on my pathway,
Yeah.
And anyways, I was going to say he offers free will. He's already put in place the consequences or the blessings, depending on our choices.
Yeah, we're going to touch on that a little bit. All right, I don't see any other hands, so we're going to keep moving on to last one here. God would have to be absolutely free. And again, this is one that I'd maybe given less thought to than the other two traits, or maybe it just had been presented in a different way than calling it this. But the author, Brother Lyon, when he's kind of talking about this other book, he kind of indicates that this trait is just as important as the first two. So that was really interesting. What do you think he means by absolutely free? What is Mr. Tozer talking about? That's pretty much it, yeah. Yeah.
Or can you say that louder?
She said, answering to no one else.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, so
no boss over.
basically, if God's able to know everything and he's able to do everything, it doesn't really matter if he's not able to act on that however he wants. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But, just being completely independent, no outside rule, nobody else is controlling him, nothing that he's subject to. He's not confined or restricted, and he's able to make the choices that he wants to exercise that knowledge and that power. So in the book, it talks about God's infinite wisdom and power are meaningless if he's not free to exercise them according to his will. That's kind of what we just said. Fundamental to the biblical doctrine of creation is the truth that God brought the universe into existence not of necessity, but of his free will. He didn't have to create us or anything else. He wanted to. He just decided to. And then after creation, God continues to uphold the universe by the word of his power, per Hebrews 1:3, again, because of his choice to do so. Not anything he's obligated or required to do. If God created and sustains the universe out of necessity, it could be argued that creation was required to supply some prior deficiency, and therefore God was and is something less than perfect. But to infinite perfection, nothing is lacking, and nothing more can be added. So it's kind of similar to the first 2 points, right?
Yes, can he or will he?
he going to do and when's he going to do it, how is he going to do it. It's all up to him. Yeah, Jeremy.
Yeah, I've been sitting here thinking about, people like to kick around that question of, could God create a rock so big that he couldn't touch it, or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
And we struggle with that kind of a question because we live with rules, live with physical rules, and we try to reason, you know, if God's so powerful that he could do this, you know, there's that whole paradox thing that we struggle with.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the, you know, the Godhead, you know, 3-1. How do we understand that? You know, we can't get our heads around it, so we look at these weird questions, you know, and try to trip each other up with it, you know, but God's just not limited to those kind of physical.
Yeah. Like,
I'd also kind of say, like, not only, you know, kind of along the same lines of what people are saying, ask all those questions, but then you also have, like, why would God do it? Like, what would be the point? You know, because so much of what God is focused on is, or I guess what we should be focused on is focusing on bringing others into His will, bringing others into the fold. And I guess, you know, the idea of making a rock so big that like, what, there's no point
Yeah.
for that. What would be the purpose of God doing that?
Yeah.
So I think you also have to ask the question of why would God do a thing?
Yeah.
You know?
I think it's also like why not, like with this whole framework, I think it's really hard to talk about God's inaction for things that are happening.
mm,
I think that's hard for us.
yeah. Yeah. You guys have all these great thoughts, and you're touching on stuff that's in here and other stuff too that's not. This is great. A couple more things to read real quick here. Again, we got to keep moving along for time. Wow. Additionally, it's stated that the sovereignty of God demands a place for his freedom to intervene supernaturally or miraculously in that system when he chooses to. And then there's a quote from Elton Trueblood that says, there does not seem to be much reason for worshiping a God who has made the world such, or made a world such that he is effectively or effectually shut out from participation in its management. And then there's a balance to that too. There's not more power in the God, there's not more of the power of God seen in a miracle than there is in his ordinary workings. He's just as much in charge and equally as powerful when acting through the established order than he is in performing miracles. I think that's an important thing to really remember. You know, even if the bizarre, crazy, miraculous thing doesn't happen, it doesn't mean God's any less powerful. Right? God never acts capriciously or impulsively, but always consistently and purposefully. He's also free not to do miracles and still be God. You know, he alone gets to decide what to do or what not to do. Okay, moving along here. And then again, some verses that I thought of, not comprehensive at all. The flood, we talked about that, kind of the God hitting the reset button. He decided to make some changes. Exodus 20, where you know the 10 Commandments and the law and all that stuff is getting established. That's what God chose and when he chose and how he chose to do that. Joshua 10, the sun and the moon gets paused in the sky at Gibeon. Jonah, we talked about that, you know, the storm, the fish, sparing Nineveh, and the plant and the worm and all that stuff afterwards. There's a lot of examples about God changing his mind and, you know, not destroying people like he was originally planning to. You know, he can change his mind if he wants to. You know, that's interesting. And then obviously the plan of salvation, right? He chose to do that from way back whenever he decided to do that, right? Before anything got created, and that's how he chose to do it. It was entirely up to him, not that he had to do it. All right, we're going to keep moving along here. So going back and just kind of summarizing again, God is sovereign, at least per this definition, right? And then at the end, there were a couple of what I first thought were side notes that were just kind of tucked in there, and I was like, well, okay, you know, these are good, but maybe not really on topic. But then I kind of read into them a little bit more, and my opinion of that changed. So God is sovereign since he is all these things, right? And, of course, that happens. He talks about, let's see here, the sovereignty of God is the resolution of the conflict between science and faith. Only because God runs this universe with such exactness and dependability through his natural laws, you know, what we call Can man achieve things like space exploration or all these other things, right? Because everything is reliable and predictable, and we're able to do the math because God has made it that way. And then second, talked about this a little bit too. Some people have a concern or belief that divine sovereignty negates human choice in the matter of salvation, and other people think that if there's human choice, it denies God's infinite knowledge and power and his freedom to exercise those. But that's not the case, right? God knew about the crucifixion of Christ beforehand, planned it before the foundation of the world. That's how he planned to reconcile us to him. But because he knew that and planned that ahead of time, doesn't mean that all the people that were involved in that incident, it didn't annul any of their free choice, right? And the choices that they made didn't frustrate, or challenge or anything the power or the knowledge of God. It still happened as he intended it to, despite their choices or because of them. And I'm going to skip that. Side note, so I'm just flying through stuff now. So basically, when I was looking at all this, I think, and another, I'll mention another one too, like the offer of eternal life, John 3:16. If there's no free choice, then that just doesn't make any sense at all, right? And if we're called to repent and be baptized, Acts chapter 2, there's a choice that's required with that, right? So there's all these evidences that we need to make choices. So rather than these being side notes, what I'm thinking that they are is just him kind of talking about we need to react to God's sovereignty. There's a response that is required of that. And so looking at that, how should we react? There are right ways and wrong ways to do that. I'm just going to kind of buzz through this real quick so we can get to our conclusion. But, reactions, proper ones, these are ones that kind of came to my mind. Again, not all encompassing, right? Submission would be in there with obedience, right? If we have this sovereign over us who's in control of everything, has all the power, has all the knowledge, and can do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants, then, reacting to that appropriately, I think, is pretty obvious. And that should have some impact as well on how we choose to react to other people around us, right? How does he look at them? How does he treat them? What does that tell us in terms of what we should be doing in our reactions to them? And then improper, just not having any reaction at all or having a bad reaction, kind of picking and choosing the parts that we want to believe or react to and ignoring others, looking for loopholes and technicalities, all those things that people do to kind of get around doing what they should do because they don't want to. Okay.
I like to use the word redefine.
Redefine.
Exactly what Paul's dealing with.
Yep.
You redefine who God is.
Yeah.
Let me hone in on that.
And another thing I think of is giving up. That's the point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just thought too is like, if somebody doesn't react properly with somebody else or it's ourselves, what's the aspect of this whole situation that gets called into question? Is it God's knowledge or his power or his ability? Or is it our reaction? Like who gets blamed when things aren't going the way that they're supposed to, right? What's the constant? What's the variable? We're not the constant. Okay. And let's do our conclusion real quick here. So I'm going to start off by referencing a quote. So Brother Lyon quotes J.I. Packer in this chapter, and it's from a book of his called Knowing God. I actually have a copy of this if anybody's interested. I'm happy to let you borrow that. In there, I guess I'll mention J.I. Packer. He's a really well-known evangelical theologian. He's passed away, but very prolific writer as well. He was one of the editors that put together the ESV version of the Bible. Very well-known man. In his book, Knowing God, he says this about man's knowledge of God's majesty. This is knowledge which Christians today largely lack, and it's one reason why our faith is so feeble and our worship is so flabby. We're modern men, and modern men, though they cherish great thoughts of man, have as a rule small thoughts of God. And when the man in the church, let alone the man in the street, uses the word God, the thought in his mind is rarely one of divine majesty. We've kind of put God in a box. And then I wanted to talk about the author here real quick, Mac Lyon. I don't know if everybody knew much about him. I knew a little bit, but not too much. Preacher and missionary in the Churches of Christ for over 50 years. He was in Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, New Jersey, and spent some time in Australia. Founded and hosted the international TV and radio program In Search of the Lord's Way, which I think is how a lot of people know him. He did that for over 30 years. Very well known, very influential in the Brotherhood. Passed away, I think, in 2015. What I found really interesting was in this book, in the dedication and in the introduction to it, he shares that he wrote much of it over a few weeks while he was in the hospital at the bedside of his wife of over 50 years while she was dying and sleeping. And, what a crazy, hard, difficult time of your life. And rather than all the other things that he could have done at that time, he chose to study and write about knowing the God that he so clearly knew so that other people could know him too. Like, that's pretty powerful to me. And then going back to Acts 17 and Paul, his reaction of what he sees in Athens, the first thing he does is start telling people about who God is. He didn't get into other aspects of Christianity. Those are important, but what Paul said needed to be done first was to tell people about this God that they did not know. And that was so important to him. I think it should be important to us as well. It made me think of Philippians 3, 7 through 11, where he talks about knowing Jesus and wanting to know God and the power of his resurrection. Like, that was his top priority. And it was for him, but it was also for him to tell other people about, and it should be for us. If this unknown God is where we should start when we talk about, or when we're talking to others who don't know him, then we need to know him ourselves first, right? As best we can. So I'm really looking forward to this class. It's going to help us with that. I think Zach has next week, is that right? And that's what Zach will be covering. He gets 2 chapters. And we are 3 minutes over, so